So, what type of fiction is Unobtainium? Is it hard or soft sci-fi? Does it belong to science fiction at all? What even is Unobtainium? Well, a good place to start would be the word itself. I mean, if you hear it for the first time, you can already figure out two things about it. It's probably some chemical element, and it's probably very hard to come by. A lot of people, however, are probably already familiar with Unobtainium from the James Cameron's Avatar. You know, that pile of precious metal on top of which blue-skin indigenous aliens have erected their settlement. However, James Cameron was not the one who made up the word. Unobtainium actually first appeared 60 years before the Avatar and is about as old as Cameron himself. Word Unobtainium was first used by the aerospace engineers in 1950s, and it meant a material that would be perfect for our needs, except for the fact that it probably does not exist in nature. Originally, it was used to describe a perfectly resistant material with a very low density, something you would build a rocket hull from. Soon, meaning of Unobtainium got expanded to include other imaginary perfect materials like room temperature superconductors or super compact and powerful fuel. And by the age of internet, it became fairly well known in science fiction communities, where it was used to describe basically anything that passed the following criteria. It is very rare and hard to obtain. It is extremely valuable and is of great interest to one or more factions of the story, and it has some unique properties that make it so desirable. This definition sounds good, but it can also include any MacGuffin, a thingy that everyone in the story wants to have. MacGuffin, as well as Unobtainium, also has some special properties and is very valuable, but the key difference is that MacGuffin is an object, while Unobtainium is a substance. First season of Loki actually turned Infinity Stones from MacGuffins into Unobtainiums, which I guess is why they suddenly became not so cool and soon disappeared from the MCU into oblivion. So, more precise definition of Unobtainium would be a fictional substance or material that is rare and or hard to obtain and has some unique properties which make it valuable for one or more factions of the story. Why exactly is Unobtainium so rare and unobtainable might vary from story to story. In terms of origins, Unobtainium can be roughly split into organic and inorganic subtypes, and both groups can be divided into naturally occurring and synthetic. Inorganic and naturally occurring is the classic Unobtainium look, some sparkly ore or glowy crystals that you have to mine in some remote or hostile place. Inorganic synthetic Unobtainiums are instead created in a lab through either physics or chemistry, and that usually requires extraordinary knowledge and resources. Organic varieties of Unobtainium might get gathered from some rare or very dangerous living organism, commonly killing it in the process, or it can be just a byproduct of metabolism of some rare species. Organic synthetic Unobtainiums, as well as inorganic, also usually get produced in some lab or factory, but this time it's bioengineering or xenobiology, and there are very high chances for this type of Unobtainium to be liquid. Let's get back to the definition. Now that we've covered general reasons why exactly Unobtainium can be rare, we can dig a bit into what are those special properties that make it so special. The original concept, super durable and light metal that engineers dreamed to have in the middle of the previous century, is actually much older than the word Unobtainium itself. Believe it or not, but people have dreamt of perfect crafting material for probably as long as they have dealt with crafting, which is long before we even evolved into Homo sapiens. Seeing how stone tools got replaced with bronze and then with iron, it's not hard to start thinking that there might be something next, something even better than steel. I call this type of Unobtainium Durabilium, and as a concept it appears at least as early as in ancient Greece, with mythical metal adamant and semi-mythical orichalcum, which could have actually been platinum or some copper-zinc alloy lost in translation. Besides being the original Unobtainium, and possibly the first one, Durabilium might also be one of the most popular. It has broad applications in modern sci-fi: weapons, armor, spaceships, mecha, implants, you name it. Durabilium is also one of the Unobtainiums that commonly makes it into fantasy, both high and low. But there's a line crossing which the metal in question stops being Unobtainium: when it's magic. The word Unobtainium implies that there is a periodic system somewhere nearby, and it's kinda historically rooted in science fiction, not fantasy. So I propose to fix definition again a little bit, to stay within hardcore sci-fi, you know. One substance that this definition will probably exclude is Philosopher's Stone, the legendary product of the alchemical magnum opus, a substance capable of turning lead into gold. Philosopher's Stone was always implied to be magic to at least some degree, so it doesn't count as Unobtainium by itself. I guess I could derive some Unobtainium category called Alchemium for substances that break laws of chemistry, but for some reason these are not very popular in modern fiction. I couldn't really find any good examples. However, Philosopher's Stone was believed to have another power, granting rejuvenation or even straight up immortality, and that surely qualifies as a species of Unobtainium on its own, the one I call Immortalium. Immortalium is a substance that can do at least one of the following: heal, rejuvenate, protect from injuries and/or death, and bring back from the dead. By that definition, Immortalium as a concept has existed in our culture for probably even longer than Durabilium. In myths and fairy tales of most nations, you can find some magic liquid or fairy dust that keeps gods alive and can revive mortals, like ambrosia and panacea of ancient Greeks, for example. Damn, those ancient Greeks were really good in inventing unobtainiums. The most common use of Immortalium in science fiction, unsurprisingly, is providing its user with physical immortality, which usually runs the plot into one of two main directions. If Immortalium is accessible to everyone, we get overpopulation situation and corresponding ethical questions. If Immortalium is only enough for few, it usually gets another Unobtainium property. It becomes Luxurium, the Unobtainium which is only owned and used by the rich and the noble of the local world building. Luxurium as a concept is also quite ancient, since the aforementioned Greek orichalcum was actually more of Luxurium than Durabilium. It was mostly used for palace decorations. In plot terms, Luxurium subtype Unobtainiums often get played along the lines of ivory, silk, spice, and slave trade history. There are places rich in Luxurium, and there are places where powerful people want it very much. And that leads to political intrigues, mind games, and ruthless bloodshed around the trade routes. And that, in turn, provides rich substance for the plot. Back to Philosopher's Stone, and it gives us one more Unobtainium subtype. Because of all the encryption and mystery that surrounded alchemy, it was always implied that a lot of true properties of Philosopher's Stone remain unknown, which I propose to call Mysterium, not to be confused with that evil board game that my math brain doesn't do well. Unobtainium might be pure Mysterium, when its key plot value is being yet unknown to science. More often, however, Mysterium is like Luxurium, just an additional quality of some already very useful Unobtainium species. That often gets lazily misused, you know, when, for the convenience of scriptwriters, a local Unobtainium variety is implied to have some even more wonderful and unexpected properties that we know of for now. Moving on from the ages of alchemy and spice trade, we get into 19th century, in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, when the science fiction as a genre starts to emerge, along with many new species of Unobtainium. I would call one of these new substances Mutatium. It's Unobtainium that transforms the organism upon use, reversibly or irreversibly. The earliest of the well-known science fiction examples is probably Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but precursors of Mutatium surely existed in culture well before that, as magic drinks and snacks in myths and fairy tales. Mutatium is terribly popular among both superheroes and supervillains. Quite a shocking amount of those folks gained their powers after overdosing some sort of substance that is poorly understood by science and/or looks very unsafe for tests on humans. Mutatium was probably inspired by the appearance of industrial pollution, carcinogenic substances, and spread of addictive drugs, which followed soon after the Industrial Revolution. Mutatium can easily cross the line and stop being Unobtainium when it becomes undesirable, when it's still rare and has very special properties, but nobody really wants to have it. Another species of industrial Unobtainium is Energium. That's essentially some perfect imaginary fuel. It commonly gets depicted as some sort of futuristic analog of coal, oil, gas, or radioactive isotopes. More often than not, it is flammable, unstable, or dangerous in some other ways. Energium can make a very solid basis for a political science fiction story, the great real-life example being Russian carbohydrate trade wars in recent years. When Energium is a part of a spacefaring setting, it is usually extra lightweight, because every extra gram in space is worth several extra thousands of monies to raise it to the orbit, and one of the key problems of modern spacefaring is making fuel take as little of that extra weight as it can. Light spacefaring Energium should not be confused with another type of Unobtainium, the one I call Transportalium. While Energium is basically a fancy sci-fi fuel, Transportalium is more complex. It is not a fuel per se, but rather it can somehow mess with quantum and/or gravity physics to do one of the following: teleportation, levitation, time travel, and faster-than-light space travel. Transportalium is a comfortable category from a scriptwriter's perspective, but it's not very good in terms of physics. If we try to find some real-life Transportalium species in science, we will get a lot of possible solutions, with a bunch of materials that differ wildly in their origins and working mechanisms, like antimatter, room temperature superconductors, or dark matter, which makes Transportalium kind of umbrella term. It's worth noting that Spice Melange from the legendary Dune does not actually qualify as Transportalium, despite its main use being for long-distance space travel. According to the canon, nobody really shovels spice into a reactor to keep the engine running. Instead, space navigators get addicted to spice to the degree when they cannot exist outside it, and that marinating overdose grants them the ability to somehow fold space-time with sheer willpower, which, as an attempt, Frank Herbert might have witnessed himself, since he wrote Dune when the new popular drug around was LSD. That brings us neatly to the next Unobtainium species, Psyonium. Psyonium alters mental and/or sensory capabilities of the user in ways that can vary a lot from setting to setting. Psyonium might be a source of mental powers, often causing telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, or all together. Psyonium can also be a weapon, like a mind control potion, a side component of a Mutatium-type Unobtainium, truth serum, or a highly psychoactive substance with very bad trips. Speaking of weaponized Unobtainiums, there is another variety that Age of Energy delivers, something I call Destructium, the perfect substance for science fiction weapon. Not to be confused with Explodium, which is not Unobtainium at all, but rather the material that most things in Michael Bay movies are made of. Destructium can come in many subspecies. It might be acid or noxious gas, it might be crystals that somehow cause fire, ice, electricity, or laser beams, or it might be a plain good old science fiction substitute for the nukes. But in every case, Destructium is causing some sort of destruction, and is valuable mostly as a weapon. If Destructium cannot be in any way contained or controlled, it crosses the line and turns from Unobtainium into a sort of force of nature. Because true Unobtainium is expected to be rare and/or hard to obtain, rather than impossible to own at all. With the age of information, our mass culture has accumulated such an array of science fiction Unobtainiums, MacGuffins, and superpowers that authors found themselves in need to introduce some new fictional materials whose whole purpose and special ability would be to negate some other overpowered figment of world building, the one that scriptwriters are not really allowed to kill. I call that type Antagonium, and it's different from Destructium in first, being very selective and specific in on whom it works, and second, usually it does not annihilate its victim completely, but rather weakens it or turns off in some way. One of the most recent additions to the Unobtainium variety is Digitronium, material capable of computation, memory storage, graphical processing, well, basically of anything that modern gadgets do, but better. Digitronium is a substance that robot brains and data crystals are made of, and it actually has a very real analog in our modern world as Taiwanese microchips, which no other country can produce for that price and of that quality. The value of their production lines is so high that it's actually one of the key factors that prevents World War III. In science fiction, Digitronium is sometimes inside robots, sometimes it's used to explain why ancient tech of long-lost civilization still works, and sometimes it's there to produce whatever digital effect or phenomena scriptwriters need to happen. On that point, Digitronium borders with the last unobtainium we have for today, Handwavium. This one is essentially a wastebasket taxon for all that's left, whatever else effects unobtainiums can produce, limited only by author's imagination. If you know of any cool examples, please tell me in the comments. In total, that leaves us with 12 different types of unobtainium. One interesting tendency I see here is that at least half of them are just some advanced variety of stuff that we already know and use, but in some way much better. Durabilium is essentially the perfect metal, Luxurium is space-setting gold, Immortalium is the ultimate medicine, Energium is the bestest fuel, Destructium is a very advanced gunpowder, and so on, and it actually makes sense. History of science teaches us that after stone comes copper and then iron, that after lumber there is coal and then oil, that after antiseptics we get antibiotics and then genetic therapy. So it really makes a lot of sense to expect that sometime in the future we will discover and/or synthesize even better materials for all sorts of uses. That is not true for all the groups of unobtainiums, however. Some of them we will possibly never obtain, and some might not even be possible at all, and are thus doomed to never break out from science fiction into reality. But how realistic are different species of unobtainium is a question on its own, which I will explore in a separate video, T-list style, rating the chances of different unobtainiums to exist. There will be also a third video in that mini-series, where I plan to take a closer look at the most well-known examples. Unobtainium from Avatar, Spice from Dune, Vibranium from Marvel, Kryptonite from DC, and I guess I could cover 2 or 3 more. I'm not yet sure what those 2 or 3 will be exactly, so if you have interesting ideas, please let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll pick just that. So if you wanna see where it all goes, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and see ya!